So we just heard the parable of the wedding feast in our gospel reading from Matthew. This is the third rebuke from Jesus at the Jewish religious leaders. And last week, Father Chris preached on the parable where Jesus told them that the kingdom of heaven will be taken away and given to a people that produce fruits. And in today's parable, Jesus is telling them that the kingdom is like a wedding feast where the king has invited those whom he has chosen as guests, but those guests don't show up. Now, these would have been guests of honor. If you're married, you know how hard it is to come to a complete agreement on a guest list, and we are commoners. So imagine how much more difficult it would have been for the king to choose who was going to be there. This was the wedding of the king's son. There would have been rich and famous people, the rich and famous of the day, and they had given him the cold shoulder. He sends for them, and they ignore him or outright refuse his call. He sends for them again, and they beat and even kill his servants. This time the king was angered, and he sent his army to destroy the murderers and to burn the city. There's a price to pay for not accepting the invitation. Next, he tells his servants to go into the main roads and invite as many people as they can find. His servants did that. And the parable tells us that they gathered not only the good, but the bad, to the point that the wedding hall was filled. And the king came in to see the crowd enjoying his feast, and he spots one guest not wearing his wedding garment. This person is bound and thrown out into eternal darkness. And the parable ends with the words, "Many are called, but few are chosen." Ain't that a kick in the teeth? Talk about a plot twist. We get all excited that the doors were open and the invitation was extended to all, no longer just to a select few. But even though the doors were opened and all were invited, it is still the king's party. While the invitation is open, the king is still in control. It's here at the center of this parable that we see the surprising reach of the gospel to the least likely of people. We see that theme at work in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning with the long opening genealogy. Then we also see that with the appearance of the Magi. That theme is at work when the last workers to be chosen are given the same pay as those who were the first to show up to the fields. Taking all of Matthew up to this point as a whole, it's easy to see that this parable is a parable of grace. If you read it on its own, it's not quite that easy to see that there's grace in this. But if you take all of Matthew up to this point as a whole, you see grace throughout the whole story. The party is finally God's party. And everyone who is there by grace alone. It's no longer by lineage. It's no longer by being a chosen race or a chosen few. It is by grace alone. But here's the thing. You have to be clothed with that grace to be there. And no matter what you may think of that wedding garment of grace when it is handed to you, you either put it on or you risk getting thrown out of the party. There's no other way to be at the party without wearing the attire the king assigns. Those who are complacent, like the group of first people who the king invited, or those who think that they got there in some other way, or those who think they can do without the clothing of grace, which everyone else is wearing, will soon find out how wrong they are. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, I think it opens a doorway for a spiritual assessment. In which group do you find yourself? Do you find yourself a part of the second group? The ones who were called at the last minute to the party and who gladly accepted the invitation and the gift of the wedding garment? Or do you find yourself a part of the first group, who knew that the invitation was coming and they initially even accepted the invitation, but only to turn away from it at the last minute and ignore it on the day of the feast? It wasn't that they didn't know the banquet was going on or that they had forgotten the time. They were so complacent that they simply chose to ignore the invitation and turn away from the king and return to their work in business or in the fields. They couldn't be bothered by the king. Does that sound familiar? I'll be the first to admit that it's easy to fall into complacency in faith. On the one hand, it's particularly easy if you've grown up in the church. When you're born into a Christian family, and raised in church, this saving grace can sometimes be something that we take for granted. We know we need it. We know we're offered it. But we tell ourselves that we've been baptized. We've made that decision. And we can feel our card has been punched. We've done all we have to do. We forget that there was a time in our lives when we were among the lost. We can be so comfortable with that grace that we forget about it or we ignore it. It may not even be that we go wild. We may lead lives that fit within what the world deems as good. But life gets busy, life gets comfortable, and faith falls to the wayside. It's also easy to be like the guy who got thrown out. To show up knowing the invitation is open, but refusing to wear the garment that the king assigns. To think that you're either too good or simply good enough on your own to get into the party by yourself. Now, if you're getting all excited and boastful that that's not you, I give you the good old saying, but wait, there's more. On the other hand, I think that's 3 hands, by the way, if you're keeping up here. On the other hand, it's also easy to be so sure of that grace and so sure of your own eternal security that we look down at others who we think are not taking their faith seriously. Or we even look down on and come to despise those who don't have the desire to come to faith. This can happen when life isn't so comfortable and we're feeling particularly righteous while enduring our trials and tribulations. So what do we do then? We think that we know better than them, and if they can't see how lost they are, why should we spend any time on them? We give up, we write them off, we move on. We think we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. We found this grace, they can do it by themselves too. We get so angry at their state of sin that we descend into our own state of sin without even realizing. If you think I'm making that up, go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever you kids are using these days, and read the comments of Christians. Do you see this happening today? The answer is yes, you all do. I promise I'm not going to make this a political speech because you can see it coming from all sides. Left, right, middle, up, down, north, south, everywhere. But never before have I noticed such a complacency with faith, so strangely coupled with such assumed righteous indignation and sheer and utter hatred for those whom we think must not or cannot be saved. Never before have I seen Christians so mad at people for not being Christians that they can't wait for them to go to hell. Not only have we, as an entire country, lost our ability to be civil with those with whom we disagree, it seems that we as Christians have lost our knowledge that the same saving grace which we are freely given is also freely available to those on the other side of the argument. They may not be there yet, but that grace is waiting for them. It's the same sin in both scenarios. Faith either being ignored by disuse or faith being abused by an inflated sense of self-reliance. In both cases, it's refusing to wear the wedding garment of grace. So how do we fix this? So now we know that Jesus was warning us about, and we see the same complacency mentioned in this parable going on in our world today. So what do? How do we fix this? Well, as I said last time I preached, we can't. But God can, and we must remember that God can and will use us as He fixes it. Now maybe at this point in your life you're finding yourself in the first group. The group that received the invitation but chose to ignore it or took it for granted. Maybe you've grown up in the faith and have simply chosen to pursue worldly desires while simply going through the motions. And those worldly desires can be sinful outright. They can be sinful in the fact that you are choosing to ignore your faith to pursue a career, a family, or just simply free time. But if that's you, there is hope, there is grace. Now perhaps you find yourself in the second group, the group that accepted the invitation and accepted the garment of grace. If that's you, that's wonderful. But there's still work to do. How do we show the lost and dying in the world that we have been invited to be clothed with grace? And how do we show them that that invitation is extended to them as well? Regardless of what group you are a part of when you walk through those doors, this morning, if you choose to accept the gift of grace, you must look to Jesus. for hope, and as a divine example every single day. And this world especially needs Christians to do that right now. When Jesus was beginning his public ministry, who was with him? Was it princes, priests, and scholars? No. It was a bunch of crazy fishermen and a random tax collector. Who did Jesus choose to eat with and to speak to? Did he seek seats of honor at meals? Did he preach to select groups with deep pockets? No. He ate with sinners, and he reached out to those with whom the religious leaders of the time despised. There's no question, far from being afraid of Jesus, these sinners and those shunned by the religious establishment of the day found Jesus and his message attractive and welcoming. He didn't bend the truth. He didn't hide his message, but he showed grace to all. A good many of those who ended up at the king's banquet table were those whom the religious types had written off. But that's grace for you, and that is our call to action. Jesus called those whom the religious leaders of the day deemed least likely to succeed. In realizing they were nothing without him and nothing without his grace, they took the gospel message of grace to the ends of the earth. They took them to the lost and dying of the world. They gave them hope, and their ministries grew and grew and grew. Even doubting Thomas. It's amazing if you hear his story. Doubting Thomas, what's the thing you think of? You think of his doubt. But where did he go? He went to India. And a church that he planted is still thriving today. Christians are still in that country thriving because of his ministry. And that was doubting Thomas. So they can do that with doubting and then put your name there. If Jesus can do that with him, he can do that with you. But think about it. Who do you call friend? Who do you surround yourself with? Is it the wealthiest and the prettiest? Is it those who look like you? To whom do you teach the gospel? Is it those who think like you and those who give the least resistance? Is it those who vote like you and are an echo chamber for what's important to you? How effective is your ministry? Do you hold your faith so dearly that you can't help but share it to the lost and dying? You have received an invitation. You have received an invitation through the gospel to sit at the King's table of grace. Now, regardless of how you answered those questions that I asked, we are reminded in Lamentations that the invitation is new each and every day. But what's at stake is of precious value. Accept the invitation and put on the wedding garment of grace, which covers your sins and your shame. But don't stop there. That same invitation that was offered to you is meant to be passed on. When we come to the altar to receive grace, it's not meant to stay in this room. When you go through those doors, you're entering the mission field. That grace which you have consumed is to be shared with the world. You may be called to plow. You may be called to plant. You may be called to water. You may be called to reap the harvest. But if you're a believer, I don't know which part of the process you're called to, but I promise you that you are called to work, and you're called to get your hands dirty for the sake of the kingdom. And here at St. Patrick's, we believe that we are called to invite, to train, and to send. All of those are invaluable, and none of those are mutually exclusive. Receive God's grace and spread it so enthusiastically that you can't help but drown out the darkness in this world. In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.